Opening the flank, it immediately creates asymmetry and contests central influence, setting a dynamic tone. Establishing central space immediately offers black excellent counterplay and opens lines for their pieces. Preparing for a kingside fianchetto, but potentially neglecting immediate central pawn presence. Developing the knight to its natural square here efficiently prepares for a kingside pawn advance and challenges white's fianchetto. Unleashing the fianchettoed bishop on the long diagonal aims for central pressure and potential kingside activity. Preparing for a fianchetto of their own, black mirrors white's setup with a bold pawn push. Paving the way for the queen's development, this subtle pawn push prepares to control central squares. Developing the dark-squared bishop to its longest diagonal now, contests the center and prepares for kingside castling. Securing the d4 square and preparing kingside castling, this move subtly fortifies white's pawn structure against black's developing pieces. Launching a bold pawn thrust, black immediately challenges white's center and opens the kingside for piece activity. Solidifying the center and preparing development, this pawn advance offers flexibility while avoiding premature central commitment. Developing the knight to a natural square fortifies the center and prepares for kingside castling, while also eyeing the d5 outpost. Developing the knight to c3 bolsters central influence and prepares for kingside castling, a sound positional step. Securing the king immediately prioritizes safety, allowing focus on central pawn breaks and knight development. Securing the king amidst the developing play, this castling mirrors black's intent while preparing to join the central battle. Solidifying the center and preparing potential pawn advances later, this move aims to build a harmonious structure. Preparing to fianchetto the queen's bishop, this quiet maneuver aims to control the long diagonal and support the kingside structure. Repositioning the knight to e7 prepares a central pawn push and reinforces the kingside's defensive structure. Developing the bishop to this square offers a new attacking perspective along the long diagonal, eyeing black's central pawns. Solidifying the queenside pawn structure, this aims to prevent white's b4 advance and prepare a central push. Initiating an aggressive pawn storm on the kingside, aiming to dismantle black's castle and exploit the open f-file. Developing the bishop here creates an excellent attacking diagonal, threatening to disrupt white's pawn structure. Centralizing the queen, this move prepares for potential queenside expansion while reinforcing the kingside defense. Bolstering the queen's influence on the central diagonal, this prepares to contest the light squares. This knight repositions to reinforce the kingside and prepare a future kingside attack, aiming for a strategic retreat to a more active square. Reinforcing the e-file with the rook signals a commitment to challenging white's central control and preparing for potential pawn breaks. Repositioning the knight to f2 aims to bolster the kingside pawn structure and potentially support a future g4 advance, reinforcing white's central pawn chain. Securing the king's flank from potential pawn storm incursions is a sound defensive posture, even if it cedes a tempo. Reinforcing the e-file now prepares for a potential central pawn thrust, locking down the queenside while white's pieces subtly coordinate. Realigning the knight on g8 to the f6 square aims to reinforce the kingside defense and potentially prepare for a kingside pawn storm. Launching an aggressive central thrust, this gambit aims to shatter black's cramped position and expose their king. Shifting the bishop to the queen's side aims to activate it, but it abandons the important diagonal control that was previously established. Unleashing pawn pressure on the queen's side disrupts black's intended blockade and opens avenues for white's initiative. The knight's retreat to d7 clears the way for the f-pawn's advance, a bold attempt to fracture white's solid center. Breaking the central pawn chain opens lines, potentially creating weaknesses for black's king while offering white greater piece activity. Recapturing the pawn solidifies the center but invites a queenside push, potentially exposing the king's flank. Suddenly, central control opens up, inviting complications and a fight for initiative. Opening the e-file creates immediate tactical possibilities for black. Reclaiming the pawn opens up diagonals for the knight, threatening a powerful outpost on e6. Unlocking the d-file offers new attacking avenues, potentially targeting white's central pawn structure. Opening the e-file now pressures black's king, potentially creating weaknesses in his pawn structure as the game transitions towards an open play scenario. Reclaiming the kingside pawn structure, though it does open the g-file for immediate consideration. Unleashing the queen to attack the weak c7 pawn, aiming to disrupt black's defensive structure. The knight's foray to e4 injects immediate dynamism, aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure and exploit the open c-file. Sacrificing the bishop for pawn structure aims to open lines, but might leave your king exposed. Opening the e-file offers dynamic possibilities, forcing white to address the exposed king. Opening the e-file decisively, white aims to exploit black's compromised king defense. A desperate gamble, sacrificing material to disrupt the powerful white queen's attack. Reactivating the rook, aiming to contest the open file and prepare for a defensive restructuring. Reclaiming the initiative, black's queen actively seeks counterplay amidst the disorganized pawn structure. Trading queens simplifies to an endgame where white's knight lacks clear targets, and black's king is surprisingly safe. Simplifying to an endgame with this recapture, black aims to leverage the potential of their active bishops against white's slightly less mobile setup. Liberating the bishop from its passive post opens a diagonal for counterplay and eyes the weakened kingside. Sacrificing material for piece activity and open lines is often a gamble, and this capture seems a desperate attempt to complicate matters. A decisive simplification, opening the rook file for immediate pressure. Reclaiming the open file with the rook aims to disrupt white's central control and prepare for a more active endgame. Securing the d-file with the rook opens up a clear pathway for further pressure on black's queenside structure. Repositioning the rook to the f-file offers crucial attacking potential against white's uncastled monarch. Reinforcing the e-file knight offers a chance to regain positional pressure. Reactivating the knight to a central outpost promises more dynamic play. Reinforcing the central pawn creates a blockade, aiming to restrict black's knight mobility. Accepting the pawn sacrifice streamlines the endgame, eliminating immediate attacking threats. Unlocking the knight's potential on the f-file now opens clear lines for its centralizing march. Unleashing the bishop to its active diagonal, this seeks to challenge white's central pawn structure. Unleashing a knight to exploit the open b-file, aiming to disrupt black's pawn structure. A bold attempt to reignite pressure along the open files, though it leaves the king a tad exposed. Activating the knight on c5 seeks to exploit white's isolated pawn on b7 and potentially pressure black's queenside. Activating the king offers a more dynamic defensive setup, anticipating potential pawn advances. The king steps out of the shadows, aiming to anchor the queenside and secure newfound central presence. Initiating a repositioning maneuver to bolster the kingside's defensive structure and prepare for future pawn advances. Repositioning the knight to a more active square, aiming to pressure black's weakened pawn structure. Shifting the king's gaze towards the queenside aims to shield against potential pawn advances and rally support for a counterplay. Centralizing the knight offers improved piece activity and better control over key squares. Repositioning the king for active endgame participation, aiming to secure central influence and potentially support pawn advances. This knight hop creates a potent threat, forcing a difficult decision about how black's king will navigate the exposed central squares. The black king continues its circuitous route, seeking safety amidst white's encroaching cavalry. Initiating pawn advances along the kingside to gain space and potentially create passed pawns later. Fortifying the kingside pawn structure aims to create a secure haven, but it concedes significant kingside space and delays kingside counterplay. Centering the monarch provides active support for the advancing pawns. Activating the bishop to a more central square enhances piece coordination and prepares for potential pawn advancements. A crucial pivot emerges, attempting to activate the king and centralize it before perpetual pawn weaknesses become a problem. A quiet regrouping, bringing the king closer to the center where it can participate in the coming fight. Initiating a pawn march to gain central territory and activate the king's presence. Activating the bishop to a more aggressive diagonal, aiming to disrupt white's kingside pawns. Repositioning the knight to a more active central square aims to improve its influence. Unleashing the bishop to the queenside creates a potent attacking spearhead. Initiating a pawn advance to gain space and create queenside activity. Securing the passed pawn's advance requires vigilance. The black king actively seeks out active squares to pressure white's structure. Establishing space on the queenside is crucial to prevent black's pieces from swarming the center. This knight repositions to potentially infiltrate the queenside or support a pawn push, aiming for dynamic counterplay. Expanding the queenside pawns probes black's rather passive bishop on d7. Anchoring the knight here aims to disrupt white's queenside expansion and prepare a potential maneuver to the kingside. Activating the king to dominate the center becomes paramount now. Shifting the bishop to g2 aims to outflank the rook on the kingside and exploit the weakened pawn structure. Unleashing a pawn storm to disrupt the enemy king's sanctuary. The knight's retreat opens the door for black's king to finally find some breathing room in the center. Reactivating the knight to exert pressure on the central squares and prepare for kingside advances. Shifting the bishop offers a subtle attack along the kingside pawn chain, forcing white to defend. Forcing the black knight back opens lines and begins a decisive pawn push. This defensive repositioning of the king aims to consolidate and prepare for a potential counterattack, though it leaves the pawn structure somewhat exposed. Unleashing the knight to a central outpost aims to disrupt black's pawn structure and potentially create tactical opportunities. Shifting the bishop to c4 aims to outflank white's kingside pawn structure and create counterplay on the queenside. Repositioning the knight allows it to hop to squares like c4 or e4, creating more pressure. Shifting the bishop to f7 anticipates white's knight coming to e4, preparing to defend the kingside pawns. Unleashing a devastating discovered check, white aims to shatter black's king's defenses and force a decisive material advantage. Chasing that knight is a key focus now, aiming to restrict its influence. Securing the king's advance with this pawn push aims to create a decisive breakthrough on the kingside. The bishop scurries to safety, recognizing the danger from the encroaching knights. Securing the central pawn advance and preparing to activate the monarch further into the fray. Hoping to exploit the pinned knight, black offers a check that might lead to a forced sequence. Securing the king's escape square with the king provides vital mobility for the endgame. Shifting the bishop to the queenside offers a better view of white's pawn structure and prepares for potential breakthroughs. Securing the king's escape route to the queenside is paramount now.